woman Thomas had been dating before his death. They'd been together less than a year, and Richard had only met her a handful of times. After the funeral, she had disappeared from their lives completely. "And your name?" Richard asked, though he already suspected what the answer might be. "Thomas," the boy said. "But everyone calls me Tommy. Mom said I'm named after my dad." Richard's legs nearly gave out beneath him. He reached for the edge of the headstone to steady himself, the lilies dropping forgotten to the ground. His mind flooded with questions, disbelief, and a strange, desperate hope. Could it be possible? Could this boy, this child with his son's name and his son's eyes, be Thomas's son? His grandson? "How old are you, Tommy?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just turned 9 last month," Tommy replied. 9 years. The timing aligned perfectly. Thomas had been gone for 6 years. If Linda had been pregnant when he died. "Does your mother know you come here?" Richard asked. Tommy's face fell, and he looked back at the grave. "Mom died last year. Cancer. I live with Grandma Patterson now. She doesn't like me talking about Dad or coming here, but sometimes I sneak out anyway. I feel closer to them both here." Richard felt as though he'd been struck by lightning. This boy, his grandson, had lost both parents. He'd been coming to this cemetery alone, seeking connection with a father he'd never known, while Richard had been grieving just yards away, completely unaware of his existence. "Tommy," Richard said, his voice breaking, would you like to get some hot chocolate? I think we have a lot to talk about." The boy looked up at him, uncertainty and a flicker of hope crossing his young face. In that moment, looking into eyes so like his son's, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in 6 long years, the first tender shoots of healing beginning to grow in the barren landscape of his grief. They sat across from each other in a small cafe 3 blocks from the cemetery. Richard had chosen it specifically because it wasn't the kind of upscale establishment he usually frequented. He didn't want to overwhelm the boy. Tommy wrapped his small hands around a steaming mug of hot chocolate topped with whipped cream, a smudge of it on his upper lip. Richard cradled his black coffee, still trying to process the revelation that had upended his world just an hour ago. "My son never told me about your mother being pregnant," Richard said gently. Tommy shrugged, his eyes downcast. "Mom said he didn't know. She found out after the accident." The accident. Even now, 6 years later, Richard could recall every excruciating detail of that rainy Tuesday morning. Thomas had been driving to work at the charitable foundation he'd started against his father's wishes. Richard had wanted his son to join Warner Industries, to learn the business he'd spent his life building. But Thomas, with his idealism and compassion, had chosen a different path. Their last conversation had been an argument, harsh words exchanged that Richard could never take back. "Your father was brilliant," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "Harvard Business School. Could have run my company someday. But he wanted to help people more directly. We disagreed about that. Mom said he started a place to help sick kids," Tommy said, perking up. "She said he met her there when she was volunteering." Richard nodded, memories flooding back. The Thomas Warner Foundation. It's still operating. I took it over after he died. It seemed important to continue his work. What Richard didn't say was how that decision had changed him. How stepping into his son's shoes had opened his eyes to a world beyond profit margins and business acquisitions. How he'd discovered parts of Thomas he'd never appreciated when he was alive. "Grandma doesn't like to talk about my dad," Tommy said, tracing patterns in the spilled sugar on the table. "She says it's too painful. All I have is this picture." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. It showed Thomas with his arm around a pretty young woman with curly brown hair, Linda. They were laughing, carefree, their future stretching bright and limitless before them. Richard's hand trembled as he took the photo. "May I?" he asked, and Tommy nodded. Richard studied it closely, noting how happy his son looked, happier than he'd ever seemed during their forced business dinners or formal family events. Your mother was very beautiful. After Mom got sick, things got pretty bad, Tommy continued, his young voice suddenly sounding much older. The medical bills and everything. We had to move in with Grandma. She tries her best, but she's getting older too, and her arthritis makes it hard for her to work much. Richard listened, a knot forming in his stomach as he realized how differently Tommy's life had unfolded compared to what Thomas would have wanted for his son. While Richard had been living in his mansion, grieving alone and burying himself in work, his grandson had been struggling just a few miles away. Where does your grandmother live? Richard asked. Over on Maple Street. The apartment building with the green awnings. It was one of the older neighborhoods in the city, not the worst area, but certainly modest. And she takes good care of you? Tommy nodded quickly, loyalty evident in his expression. She does her best. We don't have much, but she makes sure I have what I need. She works at the drugstore when her hands aren't hurting too bad. Richard thought of his own sprawling estate, the empty rooms echoing with silence, the staff who kept everything running smoothly but couldn't fill the void left by Thomas's death. What would his son think of him now, learning that he'd failed to protect his only grandchild? How did you find out about your father's grave? Richard asked. Tommy looked down at his nearly empty mug. I found some of Mom's old papers after she died. There was a newspaper clipping about the funeral and the address of the cemetery. I started coming here about 6 months ago, whenever I can slip away. It makes me feel connected, somehow. Richard felt a surge of respect for this boy, his grandson, who had shown such determination to know his father. It reminded him painfully of Thomas's own stubborn streak. Does your grandmother know you're here today? Tommy shook his head. She thinks I'm at the library. I don't like lying to her, but she gets upset when I talk about wanting to know more about my dad. As if on cue, Tommy's phone buzzed with an incoming text. His face fell as he read it. Grandma's wondering where I am. I should go. He started to slide out of the booth, then hesitated. Are you going to tell her about meeting me? Richard considered this. He wanted nothing more than to insert himself into Tommy's life immediately, to make up for lost time. But he was wise enough to know that barging in would only create resistance. I think we should approach this carefully, he said. Your grandmother might be protective of you, and rightfully so. I'm a stranger to her, to you too, really. Relief flickered across Tommy's face. So this isn't goodbye? Richard felt something shift inside him, like a key turning in a long-locked door. No, Tommy. This is just the beginning. If you're willing, I'd very much like to get to know my grandson. As Tommy buttoned his worn jacket, Richard reached into his wallet and handed him a business card. My personal number is on the back. Call me anytime, day or night. Tommy studied the card with its embossed gold lettering, Richard Warner, CEO, Warner Industries. You really are a billionaire, he said with wide eyes. Richard smiled sadly. All that money, and I never knew about the most valuable thing in the world, you. As he watched Tommy leave, Richard pulled out his phone. He had a call to make to his investigator. He needed to know everything about Linda Patterson, her mother, and most importantly, the circumstances of his grandson's life. Thomas may be gone, but his legacy lived on in his son. And Richard was determined not to fail either of them again. 2 weeks had passed since the cemetery encounter, and Richard found himself parked across the street from Maple Elementary School. He watched as children poured out of the building, their backpacks bouncing, voices rising in the excitement of freedom. His eyes scanned the crowd until he spotted Tommy, walking alone, head down, kicking at pebbles on the sidewalk. Richard had spent these weeks learning everything he could about his grandson's life. His investigator had confirmed Tommy's story completely. Linda Patterson had indeed been pregnant when Thomas died, never telling the Warner family before moving away to raise her son on her own. Medical records showed her cancer diagnosis 3 years ago, her decline, and her death last year. Tommy's grandmother, Harriet Patterson, had been his guardian since then, struggling on her fixed income and part-time work to make ends meet. Richard had approached their reunion cautiously. First a phone call to Tommy, then meeting at a park, where they'd flown a kite Richard had brought, something he'd never done with his own son. Today would be their third meeting, and Richard had something special planned. He stepped out of his car, a modest sedan rather than his usual luxury vehicle, and called out, "Tommy." The boy's head snapped up, his face breaking into a smile that pierced Richard's heart with its genuineness. Tommy glanced around quickly before running over. "I didn't know you were coming today," he said, slightly out of breath. "I thought I might surprise you," Richard replied. "I have something I'd like to show you, if you have time before heading home." Tommy nodded eagerly. "Grandma works until 6 on Thursdays. I just need to text her that I'm at the library again." His expression clouded briefly with guilt. Richard sighed. "Tommy, I don't want you to lie to your grandmother. I think it's time we talked to her about our relationship." Tommy's face fell. "But she might not let me see you anymore. She doesn't trust rich people. She says they think they can buy everything, including people." Richard winced at the assessment, knowing there was some truth to it. In his younger years, he had indeed believed his money could solve any problem, get him anything he wanted. Age and loss had taught him otherwise. "I promise I won't try to buy anyone," Richard said solemnly. "But secrets have a way of coming out eventually, and they hurt more the longer they're kept. How about we go see what I wanted to show you, and then we can talk about the best way to approach your grandmother." Tommy agreed reluctantly, and they drove across town to a building Richard hadn't visited in years. The sign outside read Thomas Warner Foundation for Children's Health. "This is it?" Tommy asked in awe as they walked toward the entrance. "This is my dad's place?" Richard nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "He started it with his own trust fund money. I thought he was being foolish at the time." He paused. "I was wrong." Inside, the foundation bustled with activity. Children with various medical conditions received treatment in cheerful rooms designed to feel nothing like a hospital. Volunteers in bright t-shirts played games with young patients or read to them. Staff members greeted Richard with surprise. The chairman of the board rarely visited in person. "Your father designed this place," Richard explained as they walked through the hallways. "He wanted children to feel safe and happy while they got the care they needed. Many of them come from families who can't afford proper medical treatment." Tommy absorbed everything with wide eyes, occasionally reaching out to touch a wall or piece of furniture as if trying to connect physically with his father's vision. In the recreation room, a wall of photos caught his attention. "That's him," Tommy whispered, pointing to a smiling Thomas in the center of a group picture. "That's my dad." Richard stood beside him, seeing the resemblance even more clearly now. "Yes, that's Thomas." This was taken at the opening day ceremony. A woman in her 50s approached them, her face lighting up in recognition. "Mr. Warner. What a pleasant surprise. It's been months since your last visit." "Hello, Dr. Chen," Richard replied. "I'd like you to meet someone special. This is Tommy Patterson, Thomas's son." Dr. Chen's hand flew to her mouth. "Thomas had a son? I had no idea." She bent slightly to look Tommy in the eye. "Your father was an extraordinary man. He changed so many lives with this place, including mine." "Did you know him well?" Tommy asked eagerly. "I was one of the first doctors he hired," she explained. "He believed in my research when no one else would fund it. Now our treatment protocol has been adopted by children's hospitals nationwide." As Dr. Chen showed them around, telling Tommy stories about his father that even Richard hadn't heard, he watched his grandson's face glow with pride and connection. For the first time, Tommy was experiencing his father as more than just a name on a gravestone or a faded photograph. Thomas was becoming real to him. On their way out, Richard stopped at the reception desk. "I've been thinking about expanding the pediatric cancer wing," he told the administrator. "Can you have the director call me to discuss possibilities?" "Of course, Mr. Warner," the woman replied, making a note. In the car, Tommy was unusually quiet, staring out the window as the city passed by. Finally, he spoke. My mom died of cancer. I know, Richard said gently. Could my dad's place have helped her? Richard felt his heart break a little. The foundation focuses on children's health, Tommy. But if I had known about your mother's condition, I would have made sure she had the best care possible. Tommy nodded, processing this. It feels weird that this big part of my dad existed, and I never knew. And it's weird that you never knew about me. It's like we've all been missing pieces of a puzzle. Richard marveled at the boy's insight. That's exactly right. And now we have a chance to put those pieces together. As they neared Maple Street, Tommy grew anxious again. What if Grandma gets really mad? Let me worry about that, Richard assured him. I've negotiated tougher situations than this. But as they pulled up to the modest apartment building with its faded green awnings, Richard wasn't so confident. Money and power wouldn't help him here. This would require something he had far less practice with: humility. An elderly woman stood on the front steps, arms crossed, her face a mask of worry and anger. She spotted Tommy in the passenger seat and hurried forward as they parked. Thomas Patterson, she called out. Where have you been? The library called looking for the book you supposedly checked out yesterday. Tommy shot a panicked look at Richard before opening his door. Grandma, I can explain. And who is this? She demanded, eyeing Richard suspiciously as he emerged from the driver's side. Why are you getting into cars with strangers? Richard straightened his shoulders and stepped forward. Mrs. Patterson, my name is Richard Warner. I believe we have something very important to discuss about our grandson. Her face paled as recognition dawned. Warner? As in? Thomas Warner's father, Richard confirmed. It seems we've both been kept in the dark about something very important. Harriet Patterson's eyes narrowed, decades of hardship and suspicion evident in her gaze. If you think you can waltz in after all this time and take him away from me, you're sorely mistaken, Mr. Billionaire. Richard felt Tommy tense beside him, and in that moment, he realized that the greatest challenge of his life wasn't building his business empire or even surviving the loss of his son. It was standing here now, trying to bridge a gulf of mistrust and pain for the sake of a boy who deserved to have all the family he could get. The small apartment felt even smaller with Richard Warner's imposing presence. He sat stiffly on a worn floral couch, a delicate teacup that seemed too fragile for his large hands balanced on his knee. Across from him, Harriet Patterson occupied her usual armchair, her posture rigid, eyes watchful. Tommy had been sent to his room despite his protests, leaving the two grandparents to face each other directly for the first time. I understand your suspicion, Richard began, setting his untouched tea on the coffee table. But I hope you'll believe I only want what's best for Tommy. Harriet's laugh was sharp and without humor. And you think you know what that is after knowing him for all of 2 weeks? I've raised that boy since my daughter took her last breath. Where were you then? I didn't know he existed, Richard replied, keeping his voice level despite the accusation. If I had. If you had, what? Harriet challenged. You'd have swooped in with your millions and taken over? Just like you rich folks always do? Richard studied the woman before him. Her hands were knotted with arthritis, her face lined with years of struggle, but her eyes burned with fierce protectiveness. He recognized in her the same devotion he felt toward Tommy, and it humbled him. Mrs. Patterson, Harriet, I'm not here to take Tommy from you. I've already lost my son. I don't intend to separate Tommy from someone he loves and who clearly loves him. Some of the tension in Harriet's shoulders eased, but suspicion remained in her eyes. Then what exactly do you want? Richard leaned forward. I want to be part of his life. I want to help provide for him, ensure he has every opportunity my son would have wanted for him. Education, healthcare, security. We've managed just fine without your charity, Harriet interrupted, pride evident in her voice. Richard glanced around the small apartment. It was clean and tidy but showed signs of financial struggle, the worn furniture, the patched curtains, the ancient television. Through the thin walls, they could hear the neighbor's television blaring. "This isn't about charity," Richard said carefully. "This is about Tommy's birthright. As Thomas's son, he deserves to benefit from what his father would have provided. Surely you can't object to that." Before Harriet could respond, there was a crash from Tommy's room, followed by a cry of pain. Both grandparents leapt to their feet, rushing toward the sound. They found Tommy on the floor, clutching his arm, his face contorted in pain. A toppled chair lay beside him, and above it, an open ceiling panel. "Tommy!" Harriet knelt beside him, her anger forgotten in her concern. "What happened?" "I was trying to fix the leak," Tommy explained through gritted teeth. "The bucket wasn't catching all the water, and I didn't want it to ruin your books, Grandma." Richard took in the scene, the bucket in the corner collecting drips from the ceiling, the aged paperback stacked on a shelf, now protected by a plastic shower curtain, and his grandson attempting repairs no child should have to handle. "Let me see," Richard said, kneeling beside Harriet. He gently examined Tommy's arm, noting the unnatural angle. "It's broken. He needs a hospital." "I'll call an ambulance," Harriet said, reaching for her phone. "No need," Richard replied, already lifting Tommy carefully. "My car is outside. We'll get there faster." What followed was a blur of activity. The emergency room, doctors, x-rays, and finally a small blue cast on Tommy's arm. Throughout it all, Richard was struck by how Harriet never left Tommy's side, how she knew all his medical history without consulting a single document, how she soothed him with familiar stories when the pain was bad. Hours later, with Tommy resting in a hospital bed, the two grandparents found themselves in the hallway, exhaustion etched on both their faces. "The doctor says he can go home tomorrow," Richard said, breaking the silence. Harriet nodded, then hesitated. "Our insurance, it's not very good. There's a high deductible." "The bill is taken care of," Richard said simply. For once, Harriet didn't bristle at his intervention. "Thank you," she said quietly. They stood in silence for a moment, united in their concern for the sleeping boy. "When Linda got sick," Harriet finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "she made me promise not to reach out to your family. She said Thomas's death had been hard enough on you, and she didn't want to complicate things or appear to be after your money." Richard felt a pang of regret. She shouldn't have had to face that alone. She was stubborn, my Linda. Like her father. Harriet's eyes grew distant with memories. "When she met your son, I warned her. I said, that boy comes from a different world. It won't work." But she loved him. And from what she told me, he loved her too. "I wish I had known them better," Richard admitted. "Thomas and we didn't always see eye to eye. I was focused on legacy, the business kind, and he wanted to make his mark helping others. It took me too long to understand what really mattered to him." Harriet studied him with new eyes. "You've changed since then." It wasn't a question, but Richard nodded anyway. "Losing Thomas forced me to reevaluate everything. I took over his foundation, tried to see the world through his eyes. It changed me. And now, finding Tommy." His voice caught. "It's like getting a second chance." A nurse approached, interrupting their conversation. "Mr. Warner? There's a call for you at the nurse's station. Something about an urgent business matter." Richard waved her off. "Tell them I'm unavailable. Family emergency." The nurse nodded and left, and Richard turned to find Harriet watching him with a hint of approval in her tired eyes. "That's new for you, isn't it?" she asked. "Putting business second?" Richard smiled ruefully. "It should have happened years ago." When they were finally allowed back in Tommy's room, they found him awake, looking small against the white hospital sheets. "Hey, champ," Richard said gently. "How's the arm?" "It hurts," Tommy admitted. "But the doctor said I can show everyone at school. And she let me pick blue." "Your favorite color," Harriet said, smoothing his hair back. "Just like Dad's eyes," Tommy added. "And like yours," he said to Richard. The simple observation, linking the 3 generations, hit Richard with unexpected force. He had to turn away for a moment to compose himself. "Tommy," he said, once he trusted his voice again, "I've been talking with your grandmother, and I have a proposition for both of you." Tommy looked between his 2 grandparents, hope and wariness mingling in his expression. "The apartment building you live in has some serious issues. That leak is just the beginning. It's not safe, and it's not what either of you deserve." Harriet stiffened. "Mr. Warner. Please, hear me out," Richard continued. "I own a small house in Riverside Heights. 3 bedrooms, a yard, good school district. It's been sitting empty since my property manager moved out last month. I'd like you both to consider moving there." "We can't afford Riverside Heights," Harriet said flatly. "The house is already paid for," Richard explained. "I'm not asking for rent, just for you to allow me to be part of Tommy's life. Regular visits, perhaps weekends sometimes. I've missed 9 years already. I don't want to miss any more." Tommy's eyes widened. "A house? With a yard?" Richard nodded. "And there's a desk in one of the bedrooms that I think would be perfect for a young man with homework. It used to be your father's." Tears sprang to Tommy's eyes. "Really? Dad's desk?" Harriet looked torn, her pride warring with what was best for her grandson. "I don't accept handouts." "It's not a handout," Richard replied. "It's family helping family. And if it makes you feel better, I'm sure we can find a suitable role for you at the Thomas Warner Foundation. Dr. Chen mentioned they need someone to coordinate their volunteer program, and your experience raising Tommy and caring for Linda during her illness makes you uniquely qualified." A spark of interest flashed in Harriet's eyes, quickly masked. "I'll think about it," she said noncommittally, but Richard could tell he'd made progress. As night fell, Richard prepared to leave, promising to return in the morning to drive them home. At the door, Harriet stopped him. "One condition," she said firmly. "This arrangement, it has to be on paper. Legal. I need to know that if something happens to me, Tommy stays with you. No foster care, no distant relatives swooping in. He's lost enough already." Richard felt a surge of respect for this proud, protective woman. "I'll have my lawyers draw up guardianship papers first thing tomorrow. Joint guardianship, with succession rights." As he walked to his car, Richard pulled out his phone and made a call. "James? I need the Riverside house ready by tomorrow afternoon. New furniture, fully stocked kitchen, utilities on. And find Thomas's old desk in storage, it goes in the 2nd bedroom." He paused. "And James? Cancel my meetings for the next week. I'm taking some personal time. Family matters." For the first time since finding Tommy at the cemetery, Richard felt a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place. The pain of losing Thomas would never disappear completely, but in helping his son's child, Richard had found a path toward healing. For all of them, 5 years had passed since that fateful day at the cemetery. The Riverside Heights house had become a true home, with Harriet's quilts adorning the walls and Tommy's science fair trophies lining the shelves. What had begun as an awkward arrangement had evolved into something none of them could have predicted, a family. On this crisp autumn morning, 14-year-old Tommy adjusted his tie in the mirror, grimacing at his reflection. He'd grown taller, his shoulders broadening, his features taking on more of his father's with each passing year. "I still don't see why I have to wear a tie," he grumbled as Richard appeared in the doorway. "It's a big day," Richard replied, stepping forward to help straighten the knot. "The Foundation's 15th anniversary deserves some formality, don't you think?" Tommy sighed but didn't argue further. At 75, Richard moved a bit slower these days, leaning occasionally on a cane, but his eyes remained sharp and clear. The years of sharing his grandson's life had softened him, filling the hollow spaces grief had carved inside him. "Is Grandma ready?" Tommy asked. "Downstairs waiting." And knowing Harriet, probably checking her watch every 30 seconds. They shared a knowing smile. Harriet Patterson had turned out to be a formidable program director at the Thomas Warner Foundation. Her practical approach and no-nonsense attitude had streamlined operations and expanded their reach. The initial job offer, made partly as a peace offering, had become a second career that gave her both purpose and pride. As they descended the stairs, Harriet stood by the door, elegant in a simple blue dress, her silver hair swept up neatly. "Finally," she said, though her tone carried more affection than irritation. "We're going to be late, and I need to check the catering arrangements before the ceremony." The three of them climbed into Richard's car, no longer a modest sedan but not the ostentatious luxury vehicle he once favored either. Richard had found middle ground in many aspects of his life these past few years. "Nervous about your speech?" Richard asked Tommy as they drove. Tommy nodded, fingering the folded paper in his pocket. "A little. There'll be a lot of people there." "You'll do fine," Harriet reassured him from the back seat. "You've been practicing for weeks." When they arrived at the Thomas Warner Foundation, the transformation was immediately apparent. What had once been a single building had expanded to a small campus. A new research wing, a family housing unit for out-of-town patients, and the recently completed education center stood as testament to Richard's commitment to his son's vision. The courtyard had been transformed for the anniversary celebration. Chairs were arranged facing a small stage, with photos of the foundation's history displayed on boards throughout the space. Many showed Thomas, in the early days planning the center, at the opening ceremony, working with the first patients. But newer photos showed Tommy too, volunteering during school breaks, reading to younger children, helping with fundraisers. As people began to arrive, Tommy slipped away to help the volunteers while Richard and Harriet greeted donors and staff. The unlikely partnership between the billionaire and the working-class grandmother had become something of a legend at the foundation, a living example of putting differences aside for a greater purpose. Mr. Warner, called Dr. Chen, now the medical director, approaching with a young couple. "I'd like you to meet the Johnsons. Their daughter was one of our first gene therapy recipients last year." Richard shook their hands warmly. "How is she doing?" "In remission," the father said, his voice thick with emotion. "The doctors say her prognosis is excellent." "That's wonderful news," Richard replied. "That program was particularly important to me. My daughter-in-law, Tommy's mother, might have benefited from similar treatment had it been available." As the ceremony began, Richard took his seat in the front row beside Harriet. They watched as Tommy approached the podium, looking suddenly older in his suit, his father's blue eyes scanning the crowd before finding them. He smiled nervously before beginning to speak. 15 years ago, my father, Thomas Warner, had a vision," Tommy began, his voice gaining strength with each word. He believed that every child deserved access to quality healthcare regardless of their family's financial situation. He never got to see how his vision would grow, or how many lives it would save. Tommy paused, collecting himself. "And he never got to meet me." A hush fell over the audience. "But through this foundation, I've come to know him. Through the stories of those who worked with him, through the continuation of his mission, and through the two people who have taught me what it means to be his son." Tommy's gaze found Richard and Harriet. "My grandparents." Richard felt Harriet's hand slip into his, a gesture that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. They had moved from adversaries to allies to friends, bound by their love for the boy on stage and the memory of those they had lost. "Today, I'm proud to announce the Linda Patterson Memorial Fund," Tommy continued. "This new initiative will provide support for families of cancer patients, covering not just medical expenses but practical needs, childcare, transportation, housing, and counseling. Because my mother understood that healing involves more than medicine. It requires support, stability, and love." Richard felt tears prickle at his eyes. This had been Tommy's idea, developed over months of discussion with foundation staff. He had insisted on using his modest inheritance from Richard, placed in trust when he turned 13, as the seed money. "And to oversee this program," Tommy said, "I'm pleased to introduce the new Director of Family Services, my grandmother, Harriet Patterson." Beside Richard, Harriet gasped softly. This hadn't been part of the plan. Tommy grinned at her shocked expression as applause filled the courtyard. Richard squeezed her hand in congratulation. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and enjoyed refreshments, Richard found himself standing before the wall of photographs. His eyes traced the timeline, from groundbreaking to present day, until they landed on a new edition, a framed picture of himself, Harriet, and Tommy at the boys' middle school graduation last spring. They were laughing, arms around each other, a family created not by tragedy but by the healing that had followed. "Penny for your thoughts," came Harriet's voice as she joined him. "Just reflecting on how life takes unexpected turns," Richard replied. "If you had told me 6 years ago that I'd be standing here with you, watching our grandson announce a new foundation initiative, I'd have said you were delusional," Harriet finished with a chuckle. "And probably added some choice words about billionaires and their egos." Richard laughed. "You still do, on occasion." "Only when you deserve it," she countered good-naturedly. Their easy banter was interrupted as Tommy approached, trailed by a photographer from the local paper. "One more picture?" he asked. "For the article about the anniversary and the new fund?" As they posed together, the billionaire businessman, the working-class grandmother, and the boy who had brought them together, Richard felt a sense of profound gratitude. The pain of losing Thomas would always remain, a shadow on his heart, but it no longer defined him. Instead, he had found purpose in continuing his son's work and joy in watching his grandson grow. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the three of them were back home, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Tommy had shed his tie and jacket, returning to his teenage self. "I have something for you," Richard said, pulling a small box from his pocket. "I was waiting for the right moment." Tommy opened it to find an old watch, elegant but worn, its leather strap creased with age. "It was your father's," Richard explained. "He wore it every day. After the accident, it was returned to me with his other personal effects. I've been keeping it for when you were old enough." Tommy turned the watch over in his hands, running his finger over the inscription on the back, "Time spent in service to others is never wasted." "I had that engraved for his college graduation," Richard said softly. "He took it more seriously than I ever expected." Tommy slipped the watch onto his wrist. It was slightly too large, but he would grow into it, just as he was growing into his father's legacy. "Thank you," he said simply, his eyes bright with emotion. As darkness fell, the three generations sat together, connected by loss but sustained by love. Through a chance meeting at a cemetery, they had found not just each other but a way to honor those they had lost by living with purpose and compassion. The boy who had once sat alone at a grave, seeking connection with a father he never knew, was now surrounded by family, different from what might have been, but no less real, no less vital. And the billionaire who had once measured success in dollars and deals had discovered the true meaning of wealth in the bonds that couldn't be bought, only earned through time, understanding, and love. In the gentle evening breeze, Richard could almost believe Thomas was there with them, witnessing the healing that had taken place, the broken pieces made whole again in unexpected ways. His son's life had been cut short, but his legacy lived on, not just in the foundation that bore his name, but in the family that had formed in his absence, turning grief into grace, and loss into love. The crisp autumn leaves crunched beneath Richard Warner's expensive Italian leather shoes as he made his way through the cemetery. The 70-year-old billionaire walked alone, having dismissed his driver at the entrance. This journey was one he always made in solitude. Clutched in his weathered hand was a small bouquet of white lilies, Thomas's favorite. 6 years had passed, but the pain of losing his only son still felt as fresh as the day he'd received that terrible phone call. As Richard approached the familiar marble headstone, he stopped abruptly. There, sitting cross-legged in front of Thomas's grave, was a boy, no more than 10 years old. The child was speaking softly to the headstone as if engaged in conversation with the departed. Richard stood frozen, not wanting to interrupt whatever was happening, yet feeling a strange sense of intrusion upon what he had always considered his private grief. "I got an A on my science project," the boy was saying. "I made a volcano that actually erupted. I think you would have thought it was cool." He paused, tracing the engraved letters of Thomas's name with his small finger. "Mom said you were really good at science." Richard felt his heart skip a beat. Who was this child? How did he know Thomas? His son had never mentioned having children. The boy wore a worn blue jacket that was slightly too big for his thin frame, and his sneakers had seen better days. His dark hair fell across his forehead as he continued his one-sided conversation. Grandma says I shouldn't come here anymore. She says it's not healthy to talk to someone who's gone. But sometimes I feel like you can hear me. Is that weird? Richard cleared his throat gently, and the boy whipped around, eyes wide with surprise and a touch of embarrassment. I'm sorry, Richard said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I didn't mean to startle you. The boy scrambled to his feet, dusting off his jeans. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't think anyone would be here. I can leave. No, please, Richard said, stepping closer. I'm Thomas's father. I'm curious how you knew my son. The boy's eyes, a startling shade of blue, studied Richard intently. They were familiar somehow, in a way that made Richard's chest tighten. I didn't know him, the boy admitted. Not really. I was born after he was gone. Richard's mind raced, trying to make sense of the boy's words. Then how do you know about him? Why do you come here? The boy hesitated, scuffing the ground with his shoe. My mom told me about him. She said he was smart and kind and that he would have loved me if he'd gotten the chance to meet me. Richard felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The implication of the boy's words hit him like a physical blow. Your mother, he said carefully, what's her name? Linda. Linda Patterson. The name crashed into Richard's consciousness like a wrecking ball. Linda, the young.